Hello, my name is AJ Goldsby. I'm a life master from Pensacola, Florida, and I wanted to bring you today another game in my continuing games examination of famous chess games. I have to thank a user. I believe it was. I'm not really sure. The forum's closed right now, so I can't look at it. But I think it was Smyslov fan on chess.com. But anyway, he rebrought this game to my attention. I had seen it many years ago, but basically forgot about it. I didn't remember it off the top of my head, and he kind of reminded me of this game and brought it back to my attention. Um, for example, he pointed out that there was some analysis in the book Power Chess by Paul Keres. I forgot what year that book was published. I do have the book. But make a long story short, this game came to my attention again. I was able to write a friend. He has a very large chess library, and he was kind enough to photocopy a magazine of some original analysis by Furman and Smyslov that was published in I believe it was a Hungarian chess magazine originally, many, many years ago. But he sent me a copy of that analysis. I don't read the language, but it's pretty easy to follow the moves. I mean, the moves are in algebraic notation, so that's not a problem. But that's called going back to the original source. But to make a long story short, I just wanted to say that this is a very famous endgame. It's a game between Mihail Tal Mikhail Tal, as some people say, and Victor Korchnoi. It's their first candidates match, game number 1 from 1968. To make a very long story shorter, to summarize, it's a famous game mainly for the fact that supposedly a lot of the experts, quote unquote experts, have said that Tal missed a win in a king and pawn ending, and that that supposedly originally Furman and later Furman and Smyslov joined up and they teamed up to analyze this endgame, and they published a very detailed and intensive analysis of this endgame, which I saw a copy of, and it was very detailed. But to make a long story short, I thought it would be interesting to analyze this game with the engines, and the engines do not support the famous author's analysis. And to mention a few of the authors that have analyzed this in-game or put their names on this analysis or carried this analysis and basically given it their stamp of approval, obviously Furman, Smyslov, as some people say, Botvinnik, Keres in the book Power Chess, and Gligoric. That's just to name a few chess stars that analyzed this endgame and agreed that Tal had missed a clear win. And I thought it would be fun to go back and, the chess engines have made such vast improvements in the last few years. Just a few years ago, say 5 or 10 years ago, I don't think any grandmaster would rely totally on a chess engine because they just weren't that strong. However, today, on a really good computer and with a really good chess engine, and I'm running Deep Fritz, mainly Deep Fritz, Houdini 3.0, but mainly I use Deep Fritz 14 now, which is brand new. I just got it earlier this year. And those engines are so strong today, they can quickly analyze all the lines. So I thought it would be fun to go ahead and run this game back through, the analysis and just see what my analysis came up. I'm going to build a web page on this game. In fact, I'm already done with my analysis, and I've already started on the web page. It's not published yet, and I will publish a link to that web page. It'll be under the little box that says show more. If you just click on that, when I get done with the web page, I will publish the link there. But anyway, long story short, we're going to go ahead and jump into this end game. It's a very interesting game. I'm going to kind of skim through the opening because my analysis here is not about the opening. I really want to get to the end game. And without any further ado, and again, this is the game Mikhail Tal, or some people say Mihail Tal, and Victor Korchnoi. And this game was played in their first candidates match in 1968. Tal is white and Korchnoi is black. But anyway, the game starts off d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, b6. This is the Queen's Indian. This game was played back in the 60s. Back then, the main line was considered to be g3, very simply. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a very solid line. Later on, Kasparov came on the scene, and anybody who's familiar with chess and chess theory can tell you Garry Kasparov, or some people say Kasparov, came on the scene, and he began playing a3 on the 4th or 5th move for black. And that's really for white rather, a3 on the 4th or 5th move for white, and that's really nothing more than the Petrosian system. In fact, when I play the system myself, I always play a3 on the 4th move because it prevents any checks or any problems. And so that's the modern system, and that's what the MCO and many of the other opening books today. I've got a brand new DVD on this opening by a grandmaster, and he spends tremendous amounts of time analyzing that, and he's come up with a lot of new ideas too. But anyway, G3 is the older line. And any book, if you have any book on the Queen's Indians, and I have dozens of them, will show that this is a solid line. And this is the line that everyone played prior to A3 becoming the most popular move. Black continues very simply: Bishop B7, Bishop G2, Bishop E7, white castles, black castles. White plays Knight C3. We'll stop here. And this, one of the things I'm doing too is this. I'm making this video for all my chess fans and all my chess students, but particularly for my chess students at the private school that I teach at. And I have a Tuesday class there. So this this video is primarily aimed at them, and so I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible. Please note, Tuesday chess class, that both sides have developed all their pieces. We still have a problem there. A lot of you guys, when you're playing games against each other, you're not getting all your pieces developed, so we still need to work at that. Notice the rapid and consistent development. First the minor pieces come out, then you get castled, then the queen comes up off the first row, connects to rooks, then the rooks find an open file, etc. But you have very clear, consistent development of all the pieces, and that's true of any opening. You have to understand the opening. A lot of openings have different ideas and different aims, like an attack on the king side, or certain squares they're focusing on. But all the openings share the common idea of controlling the center, developing your pieces rapidly, protecting the king and castling early, and the idea of Nimzovich's concept of square control. So anyway, Black next move is 794. This is a very good move and an outstanding move. It's a well-known antidote. And if Black doesn't play this, he can get problems. I mean, he can get a very congested position. So this is a good move for Black. He's got to get this now. Queen C2. There's a lot of playable moves here. I won't examine all the lines. MCO has about 3 or 4 columns of analysis and several notes. So if you're interested, you can just find an MCO 15 and look at the notes there. Queen C2, knight takes C3, queen takes C3. White takes with the queen because he wants to avoid the double pawns. Naturally, White could take with a pawn here, but these double pawns could be somewhat troublesome to White, and this is one of the main ideas, is to avoid any problems. Queen takes C3. And now Black plays C5. This is the standard theoretical move here. It's the one that a lot of grandmasters had played. In fact, this entire opening, I believe, was played in a very famous game. It was a game between Evgeny Bariv and Judith Polgar in the candidates, and I believe it was the FIDE candidates matches in 2007. And I'll post a link to that game on my webpage. You can replay it on the Chess Games website. In that game, the game between Bariv and Judith Polgar, White won a very nice game in 54 moves. However, the computer clearly shows that Judith Polgar missed several key opportunities at different points. In this particular position, C5 is not even the first choice of the computer. Deep Fritz likes Bishop E4 instead of C5. And again, if you want to see an example of this particular position with C5 as the main move, see the game between Evgeny Bariv and Judith Polgar from the World Championship candidates matches, the semifinals. I believe it was round 4 in 2007. Anyway, continuing with the game, Bishop E3, Bishop F6, RFD1, Bishop takes F3, exclam, Bishop takes F3, Knight C6, Bishop takes C6, D takes C6. Very temporarily, Black has a double pawn, but he's about to undouble it on the very next move. So this will be a good place for a diagram when I get to the web page, and there will be a few diagrams on the web page. But anyway, White goes Queen D3. White can't play pawn takes pawn. The ideal move here, if the White queen were on some other square, would be to play pawn takes pawn and forever leave Black with double pawns. But here, pawn takes pawn is nothing more than an elementary blunder, because Black simply responds with Bishop takes queen. So again, Queen D3, getting out of the pen. Now White's really threatening to take C takes D4 takes C5. So C takes D4, Bishop takes D4. C5, Bishop C3, Queen E7, Queen D7, RFD8, Queen takes E7, Bishop takes E7, E4. White has an ideal position in that Black has at least one key pawn restrained on the same color as his bishop. This is a potentially bad bishop ending. I've had a lot of endgames that I've won these kind of endgames because I would simply go with the strategy of fixing all my opponent's pawns on the same color square as his bishop, trade to heavy pieces in an endgame, that's usually an advantage for the side that has the free moving bishop. In other words, his bishop isn't locked behind the pawns. And that was Capablanca. That's known as the Capablanca principle. Capablanca is the one that originally, that I know of, first came up with that. It's printed that in public. Said that when you have a bishop, that you should get all the pawns off the color of your bishop, but also on the color of your opponent's bishop. So anyway, here black plays h5. Houdini likes the idea of simply f6, f7, f6, and king f7. I got to think that that's a little bit more a little better than what was played in the game, a slight improvement, but it's not that big of a deal. But anyway, Korchnoi plays h5. White plays king f1, and now black plays bishop takes f6. Korchnoi willingly gives himself a double pawn on the king side. In my mind, that's unnecessarily risky. As far as the engines are concerned, the engines hardly don't show much of a blip there, maybe a little bit, but you know, like again, the idea of just simply f6 and king f7 is what most of the engines seem to indicate as to be correct procedure for black, and I like that myself. I mean, in the end game, you know, there's several principles to the end game, and in one thing is when the end game approaches, you generally want your king as close to the center as possible. So f6 is a good move because it takes e5 away from white's pieces, and then king f7 gets the black king one square closer to the center for the end game. But black played bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, g takes f6, king e2, king g7, rook takes d8, rook takes d8, rook d1, rook takes, king takes. And now we've reached the king and pawn ending. This is the main position that I wanted to analyze. This is the position that all our grandmasters and famous authors and people that have looked at this endgame, especially going back to the 60s, claim that it was a clear, you know, win for white, and their analysis centered. We're going to get to that in a minute. But anyway, this is a very interesting endgame. I will say this: it's easier to play white side than it is to play the black side because of black's doubled pawns, but it's by no means easy. In fact, this gets into one of the most complex king and pawn endgames analysis that I've ever seen. So anyway, black plays king g6. I give that move an exclam. It's the most logical move, and it's also the first choice of the computers. King e2, and now black plays king g5. Not really liking that move, king g5, just on a personal preference. I like to move f5 there. If I were black, I would probably try to play f5 right away. But king g5 doesn't feel right because at some point, you know, the king can get bumped off the g5 square with either h4 check or f4 check. Either one of those moves would kick the black king. But anyway, he plays king g5. Tal plays king f3. And now black played f5. Eventually, black's going to have to play this, I think, if he's going to do well in this endgame. It might be better, in my opinion, to play e5 first, then play f5. That might seem to work a little bit better for black, and he can even follow that up maybe with f6. And that seems to be holding the draw quite comfortably. But anyway, Korchnoi plays f5. I think Korchnoi was a very strong player, obviously. He's still alive, but he's, you know, in his prime, he was one of the world's strongest players. And he always plays a slightly provocative style. If you've ever studied any of Korchnoi's games, you know, very oftentimes, A, he plays the win, and B, sometimes he plays, I think, moves that are intentionally designed to provoke their opponent into trying to do something. And he seemed to know just where that balance was. That's where his great genius lies, is that he knew when he could, you know, break the rules and when he couldn't, and when he could push the envelope a little bit and when he could not. And I think that's really, in essence, you know, that provocative style is one of the core concepts of Korchnoi's overall chess style. But anyway, black played f5. Here, white played h3. Okay, several things to note about h3. h3 is a very logical move because you want to keep the black king out of g4. That's number one. It's also a very flexible move, and it keeps a lot of white's options open. All the authors condemned that, especially Furman and Smyslov and Botvinnik. They all gave that a question mark and said that this was a bad move and that h3 missed a win, and that with e5, white would have won the games. h3 was the move actually played here. Now here's what's really funny. I mean, I could talk about this game all day because it's quite interesting, and there's a great deal of background material because there was a lot printed about this particular game, a lot of analysis and a lot of things said. Many of them turned out to be incorrect. But probably the funniest thing is, first of all, I remember when I first looked over this game, h3 seemed like a logical move to me. I didn't really see anything wrong with it. And the other funny thing about it was that, and a lot of other players, and also too, one time I remember, it's been many years ago, I remember showing this game to another master at some tournament. I don't remember what it was. It might have been right after I got the book Power Chess. And the master was around the 2400, as I remember. I don't recall his name, but he seemed to have no difficulty in drawing the position. In other words, he played the black side, and I never could quite punch through and make the win, even though I knew had memorized most of the analysis, and I had the book right there too. But he was able to hold the draw most of the time, and that incident in itself was buried in my memory and always caused me to question the outcome of this game. In other words, was this the forced win that it was supposed to be? And if so, why was one player able to hold the black side? And if it was such a forced win, why couldn't I find it? Why not we analyze that game? And that was many years ago. But anyway, another funny thing about this game is that the move H3, I did a deep overnight analysis, what's called a deep position analysis, a DPA in computer lingo for an engine guy. I really don't consider myself an engine guru. I know how to manipulate the engines, and I know how to use them and do sliding and all that good stuff in deep position analysis, DPAs or whatever. But and I know how to set up the parameters of all that. But I don't really consider myself an engine guru. I think the engine gurus are the guys who rely totally on the engines for all of their moves and all of their ideas, and I don't have to rely on the engine completely. I mean, for me, the engine is just a guide, and I use it as an assist when I do analysis, but it doesn't totally control my thought processes. So I don't lean that heavily on the engines. I mean, I don't necessarily think the engines are the complete answer yet. So I don't really consider myself an engine guru yet. So I haven't quite gotten to that level of proficiency with the engines to where I'm a total master of the engine. But there are some engine gurus out there, guys who really are good with the engines, and I mean, you give them enough time, if there is a forced win in a position, they will find it. I mean, you can bank on that. So and the big thing is I did an overnight analysis with this particular position, and Deep Fritz 14, after spending about 14 or 15 straight hours on it, and I think I set the ply for something like 20 or even 30 ply, which was like 10 or 15 moves ahead. But anyway, the engine, the move that it chose, that started off its analysis with the move H3. So I thought that was kind of funny, because this was Tal's original move. It was the one that all the authors condemned and said that E5 was a win. Now let's go ahead and take a look. And let me just, first of all, I want to finish up the game. Let's first of all just go through the rest of the game. The actual game: King F6, King F4, E5 check, King E3, A6, B3. All right, here's another move. This is actually, again, the first choice of Deep Fritz 14, but Smyslov and Furman seem to think or show that it was clearly inferior. And there's another improvement there, is that, they say that the correct move was A3. And here again, the computer finds an improvement on there, and I'll show that again in a minute also. But let's just go for now. Let's finish the game and then look at the improvements after we're done with the game. But first, let's look at the actual game. The actual game move played in the game was 31B3, King E6, E takes F5, King takes F5, F3, King E6, G4, F5, G takes F5 check, King takes F5, 36 H4, King F6, King E4, King E6, A3, B5. Now here's something real interesting. Most of the time when you give your opponent an outside pass pawn, it generally means the side with the outside pass pawn is winning easily, but here that's not the case. C takes B5, A takes B5, King D3. I think one of the reasons is the white king doesn't win this game is A, black has a pass pawn of his own that white has to watch, and also too that the king doesn't have an easy penetration square to win key pawns, and he can't get too far away. Even if he could run his king up over to the king side and pick off the H pawn, then black could just win just by jamming in his C pawn, because it's one square closer than black's queening pawn. So there's a lot of ideas here, but usually when you get the outside pass pawn, that's normally a win for the side with the outside pass pawn, but that's not the case in this particular endgame for a lot of different reasons. But anyway, now King D6, and here the engines are at 0.00, which is absolutely dead level and is a dead draw. That's where the game was agreed to a draw after 40 moves, and it's a very famous game. And we'll stop. That's the end of the game analysis. Now I want to go back just a little bit to this H3 position, and let's look at the supposed forced win that Tal supposedly missed. Let's go back and look at the move E5. We're going to mainly stick to Smyslov and Furman's analysis as quoted by Paul Keres in the book Power Chess, and you can find that. I believe it's called The Road That Wasn't Taken, or something to that effect, and it's, I believe, on page 212. I mainly don't. There's a lot of different lines and branching lines in this particular endgame. I'm not going to explore all of those. I'm primarily concerned with sticking to the line that the engine considers, or I consider, as best play from what I know of king and pawn endings. And a lot of times they're also the first choice of the engines. But anyway, e5 exclam supposedly, which is, the winning move. f6 exclam, h4 check exclam. Again, these are all the best moves according to the engine. King g6, king f4 a6 exclam, a3, b5 exclam. Normally when you give your opponent, again, if you give your opponent such a dangerous outside pass pawn, that's dead losing the black, but apparently that's not the case here, and you'll see why in a minute. C takes b5, c takes b5, b3 exclam, and now black plays f takes e5 check here. And if the white king takes the pawn, I'm not sure exactly what happens. I didn't analyze that extremely deeply with the computers, but the move given by Smyslov, Furman, and Keres, and several others, is king e3 double exclam, and that is a double exclam move. And normally, not recapturing a pawn in a king and pawn ending is like suicide. It's literally the equivalent of resignation. But here, that's not the case. In fact, because of this danger, for example, let's just pretend for a minute that the black king were to play king h6, white simply wins by playing a4 here rather, and just running his queen rook pawn up the board. And the black king is outside the square of the pawn, which means the square of the pawn being from, you just draw a line diagonally to the here, and then the square of the pawn would be from a3 to a8, a8 to f8, f8 to f3, and back over again. That would be considered the square of the pawn. If the black king is inside the square, he can win or draw, but if he's outside the square, then he loses. So that's a little concept, a very basic concept of pawn endings that every chess player should know at some point. And most of the players that I'm talking to will have already heard of this idea of the square of the pawn. But if you've never heard that before, it's an easy way to calculate if you can capture or get to a pawn if it's racing up the board to queen, is just see if your king is inside the square of the pawn. And there's lots of web pages where they talk about that. You can simply Google that topic. But anyway, king e3, that's a double exclam move. That's the move given by Smyslov, Furman, Botvinnik, and Keres, and they give that a double exclam. And now black, believe it or not, his best move is the engine move, and it's to return the material immediately with f4 check. G takes f4 check, e takes f4, king takes f4, king f6, king e4, king e7. Again, these are all the moves analyzed by Smyslov and Furman, and they're the first choice of the engine most of the time. a4, c4 exclam, a5, c takes b3, king d3, king d6, king c3. Now here's where we have an amazing position. The engine shows that king c6 draws just real simply, and I'll show you that immediately. Apparently our famous analysts, this is where they blow it. Some 20 moves later, this is where all the grandmasters blew it. They said that the correct move there was the move given in their analysis is king c5. I give that a double question mark, not because it's such a terrible move. I mean, it appears to be the correct move because black grabs the opposition, but apparently here grabbing the opposition loses by force, and after king c5, white simply plays king takes b3, e5, f3 exclam. And now the main idea is that sooner or later black's going to have to push his pawn, and the white king's just going to run up the board over there. I mean, white will, white wins this position easily. You can check that out with any engine if you don't believe me, or check my webpage. On my webpage, the analysis will be much more detailed. But after king c3, black draws, and again, any good engine, Houdini 3.0, Deep Fritz 14, Stockfish, I mean, I could go on and on and on. The list is almost endless. It's not quite endless, but there's a great number of engines out there, Deep Shredder, and a few others that will quickly show you that this endgame is drawn. But if you want to analyze with any of those engines, you can. But very simply, if black simply plays king c6, then it's a simple draw. All the engines confirm it, and here's why. We'll see why. After king takes b3, king c5, king c3, b4 check, king b3, king b5, a3, king takes a6, king takes b4. Now here's the drawing move. The main move is king b6. Black grabs the opposition. This is the difference between the other line. Is the other line, black was unable to retake the opposition after the capture of pawns, but in this line he takes the pawns. And after king c4, king c6, king d4, king d6, king e4, king e7, king e5, it looks like you might think white's winning because of the opposition, but he can't win. King f7, f3, king e7, f4, king f7, and all the engines confirm it's a dead draw. Even if white somehow manages to advance his pawn, exchange off these pawns, and wins black's king rook pawn, black could even allow that to happen. As long as his king can get in the corner or even reach the f8 square, it's a known book draw. It's a dead draw. And at this point, all the engines, zero out at 0.00. They show absolutely no play for either side at all. And you can easily say that that's a dead draw. I mean, that's as dead drawn as a game gets. And a lot of those, that entire line was following the first choice of the engine moves, either Houdini 3.0 or Deep Fritz or Deep Shredder. So, and what I know about king and pawn endings, but it's a dead draw. And if you don't believe me, you can check it out there, fire up your own engine, and play around with that position. If you play around with it long enough, you should be able to convince yourself it is a dead draw. Now we'll return to the actual game, the other improvement that I wanted to show you in this king and pawn ending, again to improve on the analysis of Smyslov and Furman that was quoted in the book Power Chess by Paul Keres. King f4, e5 check, king e3, a6. Here we have the b3 move. This is the move that supposedly, Keres said was, one author gave it a question mark. I believe Keres gave it an inferior mark. According to them, the correct move, or the winning move, that might have generated clear winning chances, was the move a3. And now we just follow this line. This is all following the engine moves. King e6, e takes f5 check, king takes f5, f3, f6, g4 check. I don't know if I like that. That's the line given by Furman. It was later improved upon by Smyslov, but the engines don't like it. Maybe the simple h4, as Deep Fritz like, is a little bit better there. But we're following the book analysis that was given originally by Furman and Smyslov, or Smyslov if you prefer. g4 check, h takes g4, h takes g4. Now here's where things get weird. Here, I teach all my students that in king and pawn ending, your king belongs near or in the center. And that's a very simple concept. I mean, you learn that very early on, most king and pawn endings. One author published an analysis with king g5 and almost analyzed it out to a forced win for white. And another one, the line that Furman and Smyslov were stuck on was 35 king g6. But king e6 seemed to be a much simpler move, and now it's a dead drawn position. And I'll just give you a sample line here. It gets to a very similar position that was reached in the actual game. King e4, b5, c takes b5, a takes b5, b3, king d6, king d3, king c6, and again we have a dead drawn position. It's 4-on-4. Artie Bisguyer, I was one time analyzing a endgame with Arthur Bisguyer. He's a former U.S. champion, very famous grandmaster. And Artie Bisguyer once told me, he said, this is drawn by what he called mutual fear or mutual terror. And what he was describing at a game, it was a king and pawn ending that he analyzed at a U.S. Open many years ago. I think it was back in the 70s when I was first getting started. But he described this as drawn by mutual fear or mutual terror, because the idea is both kings, the white king can't run off, say, too far over here, because this pawn just plows in and makes a queen. And the same thing goes for black's king. If black king gets too far outside the square of this pawn, then white runs his a pawn up the board and makes a queen himself. So neither king can go off on a long jaunt like is normally necessary and try to win this game. For example, you might be tempted, if you were white, to play king e4, king f5, and king takes f6, trying to make a queen. But as soon as your king got to f5, you play c4 and just run this pawn in, and just counting squares or counting the moves, the number of moves it takes for each side to do what they want to do, you'll find out that it's a pretty simple win for black. But anyway, I've analyzed this position fairly deeply. Again, I have a web page. I have not finished with the web page. I've already begun the web page, and when I'm done with the web page, and it has a great deal more analysis than you will find in this video. I tried to skip all the analysis because already this video has gone almost 30 minutes, and I didn't want it to run too long. However, it did need to be a certain length simply because, I had to address the famous analysis, the so-called forced win for white that Tal missed. And to prove that conclusively, I think I had to at least run through the main line and try to explain it. And again, you can, when I post my webpage, you can check it with any chess engine. I've already checked it with all the good ones, Deep Fritz 14, Stockfish, Houdini 3.0, and several others. And again, I'm 99.9% certain that that this is absolutely a draw, and Tal never missed a win. So I'm a big fan of Tal, so I feel like I'm sort of redeeming Tal he didn't miss a win, although for many years people had claimed he did. So I'm not sure if he even, Tal is already dead, and Korchnoi is still around, but he's much older now. But I'm sure Tal, was convinced that he'd missed a win at some point, and it would be nice, to just as a fan of Tal to show that he really didn't miss an easy win in a king and pawn ending. And if anything, it was far from easy. In fact, I would have to say on a scale of 1 to 10 of complexity and different ideas that I saw in this king and pawn ending, and the analysis done by Smyslov and Furman, I would have to say this is literally maybe one of the most complicated king and pawn endings I've ever seen. Well, that pretty much does it for my video. I know the Tuesday class by now is probably, they're ready to see this video come to an end. So I'll go ahead and conclude this. Thank you for watching my video. If you like my videos and enjoy my videos and want to support my efforts of doing good chess videos, high quality chess videos, and doing quality chess web pages, because I usually try to crank out a web page that goes with an important video, especially for an important game. And again, I'm not done with the web page, but it should be posted within the week. If you'd like to support that effort, please go to the PayPal website. That's www.paypal.com, and make a contribution under my email address, which is LifeMasterAJ. All one, just run it all together, no spaces, no commas, no hyphens, no underscores. LifeMasterAJ at yahoo.com. And that pretty much concludes it for my video. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.